We're live.
We are live.
Geena, I'll let you introduce us, but hey everyone, it's Geena and Ellie. We're back with the Vulcan Performance Podcast as we have rebranded. And so you can find us under Impetus Health if you want to look at any of our old podcasts. But Geena had an awesome idea for the show today, so I'm going to toss it to her.
Yeah, I think this has just been, I've heard a lot of misconceptions around cortisol specifically, but also like insulin and glucose too. And so there's just a lot of fear mongering going around with lots of things on Instagram, but cortisol is one reoccurring hormone that I've heard people just honestly demolish. Like they think it's the worst thing in the entire world, and I think people are scared of it. And so I wanted to do a podcast with Ellie and just kind of break some of the fears around these hormones, let people understand what they are, what their intended purpose is for the body, and how to break any misconceptions that might be surrounding them.
Yeah, thanks, Geena. And it was interesting too. Geena put out a poll on our Instagram, kind of just testing the waters to see if these hormones really do get a bad rap like we think that they do. And our suspicions were confirmed. So there were just a lot of, which, I mean, we can talk about the poll if you want to, Geena, or we can just end it there. But did you have any, like, initial thoughts when you saw the poll numbers come in?
Yeah, so I'm pulling it up because I forget the exact question. Okay, so I asked 5 questions and I only screenshotted 2 of them because these were like the 2, I don't know, the craziest outcomes. So the first one I said was, do elevated cortisol levels make you gain weight? And 78% of people said yes, and 22% of people said no. So that 100% confirmed my suspicions that people just have their perception of what cortisol is, I think, is a little bit skewed from actually what it does within the body. And then the other one said, should you eat a food if it spikes your glucose? And it was 40% yes, 60% no. So kind of split there, but also just, I don't think people have the full picture. And just knowing that our bodies are smart, like this is supposed to happen by design in a way. And extremes on either end are not necessarily a good thing if we're looking at chronically, so over time, but in the acute sense, our bodies are wired to know what to do. So just trying to build people's confidence that we were created by design and we know what to do.
Right, and I think that's a great way to start this podcast, is that Geena and I are passionate about we're passionate about giving the best information that we can, and then once people are armed with a certain amount of knowledge, they can make decisions for themselves, and that is super empowering. I think it's just important to say here that anyone should be wary of someone who is trying to make such strong statements that it's making you super fearful of a certain type of food, or maybe err on a very extreme methodology when it comes to, or choose some type of extreme eating pattern. I think it's just important to know that there is so much nuance to nutrition, and like Geena said, our bodies are made to maintain homeostasis, and they're really smart, and they can do that. So that was a beautiful segue, Geena. So our goal today is just to give you guys information, and then hopefully ease some of these fears that seem to be attached to cortisol and insulin. So okay, so the way this is going to work is I'm going to start with insulin. I'm going to give you basically answer the 3 questions Geena laid out about what it is, why it gets a bad rap, and then just some implications as a result of that. And Geena's going to do the same, and then we'll just make this very conversational and ask questions and kind of address some common concerns that people have. So, but interrupt me at any time, Geena.
Okay.
Because I'm going to be talking pretty slow, because a lot of this first part is pretty scientific, but I'm going to try to make it super easy. So if you think someone might not understand what I'm saying, just correct me.
Okay.
Okay. So starting with insulin, what is it? Okay. Insulin, simply put, Geena, do you know where it's produced? In the pancreas. Oh, sorry. I don't know why I just answered.
In the pancreas.
Wow, that was like teacher mode. I literally asked a question. I'm not supposed to be quizzing you. So insulin is made in the pancreas. Okay, it's produced in the pancreas. This is a little organ that sits behind your stomach. It looks like a little leaf. Okay, so what insulin's primary role is it's supposed to control glucose in the body, so sugar in the body. It does a few other things, but that's really where we're going to focus on today. Okay, so it's the primary hormone responsible for glucose control. Okay, then the second point, this is some corollary stuff that it does, is it also plays a role in muscle protein synthesis, something people don't normally think about when it comes to insulin. So you can, it can help you build muscle in simple terms. And then circling back to point one, it helps you turn food into energy. Simply put, and I'll repeat myself a lot so this really gets ingrained. Glucose helps control blood sugar, and it helps you turn food into energy. Now, that's really important because when we're eating food and consuming it in hopes of being able to use it as a fuel source, we cannot use it as a fuel source efficiently without insulin. Okay? So that's really important. Okay, so how it works. Some simple pathophysiology here. It's way more complicated than this, but basically when you eat a meal, you're ingesting food through your mouth. As soon as that food hits your stomach and your body starts to recognize the glucose or the sugar or the carbs, however you want to say it, in it, our pancreas is told, okay, I need to secrete insulin. So when your body registers glucose in the bloodstream, your pancreas releases insulin. Now that insulin, the way that they taught us in nursing school, I love this methodology. It's the key that unlocks the cell. Have you ever heard that, Geena?
That's exactly how I learned it too. And it was so helpful.
It's so helpful because it can get pretty hard to visualize, but the way I like to remember it is, okay, if food is fuel, we have to have that food or the glucose inside of our cell for the energy production process to play out, right? I think a lot of times we get confused of like, where does that glucose actually go? Yeah, it's in your bloodstream, but then we need it to get inside the cell for ATP and for everything else. Okay, and insulin is what basically opens up the little door to the cell and says, hey, glucose, you can come inside. Mm-hmm. All right, so why is this helpful? Going back to the fact that glucose is energy, it's the food that our cells need to function. Okay. Now let's say we're moving on. That glucose gets inside the cell. Now what? Okay, one of two things, primary things, is going to happen. It's either that glucose is used immediately by the cell, or it's stored. So it's used immediately or stored. Now, we're going to circle back to this in the implications, but for most people, unless you're training or you're working out or you're moving while you're eating, which is not common, it's not likely that it's going to be used immediately. It's probably going to be stored, right? Now, that's a very general statement. There's a lot of nuance there, but that's kind of where we're going to sit with it. So I'm going to give you two extreme examples so you can visualize this. If it's used immediately, I want you to think about, let's just use a biker on a bike who's consuming like just a carb gel or something. That's going to be used immediately. Their muscles are working. That glucose is going to be used for fuel, right? And then let's say, Geena, you're sitting at your desk. You worked out at 6 a.m. and it's 2 in the afternoon and you're sedentary and you consume a meal with carbohydrates. You're probably not going to immediately use that energy, right? Mm-hmm. Most of it is going to be stored in the form of
glycogen.
Yes. So I'm sure a lot of people have heard. Am I getting too sciencey, or is this okay?
I'm eating this up right now.
Okay. I want to make this entertaining and not like a lecture. But glycogen is something that I'm sure if you've ever run a marathon or you've played sports or even just had a pathophysiology class, you've heard of glycogen. This is how glucose is stored in our body. So if we're not going to use it immediately, it goes to be stored for later use, right? Now, glycogen is primarily stored in the muscle or in the liver, okay? So it can be pulled for later use. And here is my little caveat that I'm going to insert for why I am such an advocate, and Geena as well, for building muscle mass. A primary reason is the more muscle you have, the more real estate you have available to store carbohydrates or glucose as a later fuel source as opposed to fat. So it's just more real estate. So build muscle, focus on building muscle, and that will help with a lot of things, blood sugar control, weight management, all of that. Okay, so let's just move, we're past the pathophysiology. What are some of the implications of this? So people with a healthy metabolism, and that term can mean a lot of things, but people who, let's just say, are active and they eat a primarily healthy diet, they're going to respond sensitively to insulin, okay? I think, Geena, you tell me if you've heard this as well, but I think people get confused when they hear the word insulin sensitivity versus insulin resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of put those things together. We want to be insulin sensitive. Like, that's a good thing, because what happens is if you're insulin sensitive, your body is able to quickly shuttle that glucose in your bloodstream into the cells. So it gets it out of your bloodstream, because we don't want sugar in your blood for extended periods of time, because that's where you run into issues with chronically elevated high blood sugar levels. Okay, so we want to shuttle into the cell. If you're sensitive to insulin, that's going to happen. If you are someone who is not metabolically healthy, you might have prediabetes, you might be overweight, then what's going to happen with a lot of people is you can become what we call insulin resistant. And what that means in very simple terms is you now require far more insulin to shuttle the same amount of glucose into a cell as an individual with a healthy metabolism. So your pancreas is working overtime, and just for simple math reasons, let's say the healthy person needs, I'm just going to use units, but this is not how it works. Let's say 5 units of insulin to shuttle glucose into the cell, and the insulin resistant individual needs 10, right? So, crude example, but you get the point. So far more insulin is needed to get sugar out of the blood than a healthy person, and when you become insulin resistant, what happens is you build up a tolerance to insulin, and this is not a good thing. This can lead to weight gain. It can lead to prediabetes or even type 2 diabetes, and it's just a bunch of stuff that we don't want, okay?
Mm-hmm.
The other thing to kind of throw in here, too, is visceral fat storage is one of the primary ways that people with insulin resistance, that fat kind of manifests. Yes, it can obviously come up in terms of body fat, like you would find in different parts of your body that are pretty superficial, but visceral fat is really bad because it's around your organs, and so that's just not what we want. Okay, I'm almost done here. I don't want to get more into the science. Oh, and then another thing, so what that I found like really interesting with the pathophysiology is that basically, like, if you're insulin resistant, like I said, your body's having to pump out more insulin, and this nasty cycle starts to occur where your body is we have fat in our cell as well that we use as an energy substrate, and if you keep pumping out a ton of insulin, your body gets kind of confused in the sense of like, oh shoot, like, why do I have so much insulin circulating? So then your cell starts to actually release some fat into the bloodstream, which is in hopes of helping our body have more of a fuel source, right? Because we're not able to use the sugar in our bloodstream efficiently because we're not unlocking the cell with the insulin that we have. So your cell releases fat. Now we have fat circulating in our bloodstream, which can lead to hypertriglyceridemia, which I'm really bad at saying, but it's a lot of fat in the bloodstream, which we know can turn into plaque and a bunch of other issues. Okay, so finally, 5 final short points. What does this mean for me? How can I use this information practically? My biggest thing is just be aware of added sugar in the diet. Okay, so my general recommendation, if we work with you individually, this would change, but I try to tell people to stay under 25 grams of added sugar per day. Because the more added sugar you consume, the harder it's going to be for you to just control blood sugar levels, right? Mm-hmm. Even if you have a healthy metabolism, we want to try to avoid it. Number 2, plan your carbs most of your carbs around your workout. So, like I alluded to earlier, if Geena's at her desk eating a meal and she's sedentary, a lot of those carbohydrates, or even just the food, even if it's not carbs, just the food is probably going to primarily be stored as opposed to being used. So if I have worked out early that morning, and it's dinner time, I'm not going to have my heaviest carb meal 12 hours away from my workout. Now, this leads me into my next point, because I'm not saying do not have a carb at every meal. I want you to have a carb at every meal. But my next point is no naked carbs. So if you are going to, let's say, work out super early and you're trying to plan your dinner, choose a carb that is what we call a high fiber carb, or a carb that is not super processed, right? So maybe I'm going to choose beans over white rice, or I'm going to choose a whole grain bread over a white bread. Little swaps like that are higher in fiber, which can help mitigate the spike in blood sugar, which I'm not trying to scare you. That's not a bad thing. Every food is going to make your blood sugar spike, but if we can pair that carbohydrate with fiber and a protein, we're going to have a more gradual increase as opposed to a really, really, really sharp increase, which again is not bad, but we always want to pair it with a protein. And then circling back to the sedentary comment I made, Geena and I have alluded to this before, but there's a lot of benefit in, a ton of benefit, not just a lot, but in moving around after your meals. So my biggest suggestion is honestly going to fall in this category, but basically if you're eating 3 meals a day, if you can get up and walk around for 5 minutes after each meal within an hour of finishing, that's ideal. It's like 60 to 90 minutes. Your body's going to be very efficient at shuttling that glucose either into your muscles or your cells, as opposed to storing it as fat. So really great for blood sugar management is just walking around, taking a short walk. That's what we used to do before we became super sedentary over here in the West. People would eat and then they would either, walk around to go talk to someone in the town square or shop or whatever. It's not normal to go eat and just recline on a couch, right? So 5 minutes of walking after each meal. And then I think that...
Sorry, Ellie, I love that you just called it a town square.
I was gonna go like caveman, and then I was like, wait, that's like way too old school. Yeah, I'm gonna kind of stick to more of the 1800s.
That was
or even 19. Honestly, I think a lot of it comes back to the Industrial Revolution, but that's a great thing. We're not gonna get into that. But I think like when we were walking around often and like we didn't have cars, we didn't go eat fast food and then get in our car and drive around for 4 hours. Like we're just so much more active, and that really shows today, especially with a lot of our modern food environment and struggles with diabetes and stuff. So, tell me, what do you agree with? What do you disagree with? What do you want to point out?
Well, I'm curious. One of my favorite people on Instagram did this. He was essentially trying to show that if he spiked his blood sugar every single day, that he could still lose weight being in a calorie deficit. Did you see this?
You told me about this guy, yeah.
Okay, it's very interesting because I think one of the biggest things people think is that they try to avoid spiking their blood sugar like at all costs. Like any food that spikes your blood sugar, instantly write it off. And it's like one of the foods that spiked his blood sugar the most was watermelon.
Oh, I believe that, yeah.
Even compared to like, he did everything. He would do like just a fruit in isolation, or he would do like Skittles or cereals. He was choosing like a bunch of different options. So it wasn't like he was just choosing candy or fruit. Like he was testing out all of these different options. And he kept his calorie deficit the entire time, and then did that one carb in isolation per day to spike his blood sugar. And he still saw pretty much the expected weight loss with the deficit he was in. And so just to ease people's fears around this, ideally, you're not just eating like candy all the time, or even like watermelon by itself. But if your goal is weight loss and you remain in your calorie deficit, that's not hindering your progress. So just because glucose is spiked or whatever the case is, that's not ruining your progress.
Right. And I think you prefaced it well, though. I would say if your goal is weight loss, that's a really effective way to look at it and be like, hey, I can still enjoy certain foods. But at the same time, you and I both know very healthy looking people that have terrible blood work. I'm very close to one person in my family who has this exact scenario. And so, do I think that Skittles once a day, spiking your blood sugar if you're going to maintain a calorie deficit is going to just throw you into prediabetes? No. No, it's not that aggressive. But I do think if your goal is weight loss, that works. But if you're looking at, okay, like overall health too, it might be like wise as well to consider not intentionally spiking your blood sugar with Skittles. Only because, and I'm not saying you're wrong, I'm saying because, at least in my experience from a behavioral standpoint, it becomes very hard unless you're this influencer guy who's doing this for a reason and for data purposes. It's hard to maintain a calorie deficit when you're eating, 300 of those calories in Skittles and they're not keeping you full or doing really much for you. They honestly just make you crave more sugar. That's something to consider. The average person isn't going to maintain an adequate calorie deficit that way.
Yeah. No, 100%. And I tell people, because everyone's a little bit different. Like, there are some people who need to go cold turkey and just remove things because that's how they're going to stay consistent, and that's fine. And there are some people who can do a really great job of regulating those things and want something small every single day. Yeah. And so you need to know, like, your tendencies as a person and choose the way to incorporate those foods in a way that helps you stay consistent long term. So the goal is not like complete removal of these foods, but to enjoy them in a way that helps you stay consistent with your plan, like, for the rest of your life.
Yes. Yeah. So I think that's a great point you brought up.
Yeah, that was really good. That was super helpful. I think that was the main thing that people thought based on our poll, was that you need to avoid those foods at all costs.
So then why do you think insulin gets a bad rap?
I think people associate insulin, like, automatically their brain goes to insulin resistance. And people who have insulin resistance, a lot of females, it's because of like PCOS. That's one of the biggest correlations I see. And because of that, they tend to have, like you said, visceral fat, specifically in the abdominal region. And so it's almost this pattern of weight gain that's really not ideal, especially for like really anyone but females who are a little bit more conscious of what they look like. And so automatically I think people just think, oh, I need to be super mindful of this because if not, I'm going to gain belly fat. That's what my interpretation of it is.
Yeah. And I think it's cool to insert this as well, is that insulin is actually abused as a performance enhancing drug in a lot of realms, like the bodybuilding world and I'm sure other areas, but it's banned because it is such a powerfully amazing hormone. And when we think of insulin, our mind goes to, or I think maybe just our generation or whatever, for whatever reason, goes to, oh, bad, insulin, bad, weight gain, insulin resistance. And it's like, actually, it's a performance enhancing drug. People take it to or to improve, like I said, muscle building capacity, and then also it helps shuttle in more nutrients to the cell through vasodilation. And so very powerful, so it's actually a great thing. We just want to respond well to it, and yeah, ideally not struggle with insulin resistance. But I also have seen a lot of clients as well who unfortunately like immediately just go to insulin resistance as their problem. They're like, oh, I'm insulin resistant, when the reality is like I'm not a doctor. Your doctor has to tell you that, but actually that's not the case. Maybe we're just not aware of how we can use the plate method to make sure we're not eating naked carbs and that you're pairing protein and fiber at all of your meals with your carbohydrates. Like, we don't need to blame insulin on insulin resistance on all of our problems.
100%. I was going to say, I think it's really powerful if there's a certain food that you love, like maybe it is some type of a high sugar food. What can you put with it? Like, there's a lot of power in figuring out what can you pair with a food you love that maybe isn't as ideal in helping you meet your goals. Because if you put protein with a carbohydrate, we do know that the blood sugar response is significantly mitigated. So just knowing these like hacks, for lack of a better word, is really helpful, because you can enjoy, maybe it is a little bit higher sugar food with a protein source, and you won't have such a negative spike to your blood sugar.
Yeah, that's my last point I'll make on insulin. Then we'll switch to cortisol. I have clients that this shocks them when I say, "Hey, if you're gonna enjoy the birthday cake, make sure you eat some protein before in a meal." And they're like, "What? I was gonna save all my calories for the cake and just eat like very small, like a bird, and then and then enjoy all my calories for the cake." And I'm like, "No, like eat the full chicken breast. Don't eat half.
Mm-hmm.
Eat the full chicken breast. Get a lot of that protein in. Number one, you're gonna eat less cake, and then number two, again, like Geena said, the blood sugar spike is gonna be a bit more manageable if you pair it with a protein." So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was really helpful.
Cool.
Okay, should we go to cortisol?
Let's move on to cortisol. I'll give you your 5 minutes and then I'll interject. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Go ahead and walk us through it, Geena, and I'll ask questions after.
Yeah, cortisol, I feel like out of the two, maybe it's just more of a hot take right now that people are kind of victimizing cortisol for all of their problems. So drinking coffee in the morning without any food spikes your cortisol. Working out too high intensity spikes your cortisol. And they're almost like pinning these things to never do them because if you spike your cortisol, you're going to gain weight. That's just the general picture that's painted on Instagram right now with all of these different things. So most people know cortisol is a stress hormone. That's typically what it's known for. It's actually made from cholesterol. And so in your brain, you have something called your hypothalamus. And this is I like to think about it as the master control center. So I don't know why I get that picture of like a cartoon where there's like all these little things going on in someone's brain. That it's like doing all the calculations at your hypothalamus. And based on the inputs that it gets, it decides what signals to send out. So when you're thinking about hormones, all they're doing is responding to some input your body's receiving. So it's not like your cortisol is just spiking because it decided it wanted to one day. It's responding to an input. And it's the same thing with insulin. It's responding to an input from your body. And so with cortisol, when your hypothalamus takes in that there's some type of a stressor, cortisol is one of the hormones that's released. And that's from your adrenal cortex. Not that that matters. And so cortisol is released into your blood. And it's really a fight or flight response. So your sympathetic nervous system is, you've probably heard of your fight or flight. Your parasympathetic nervous system is kind of that rest and digest. And so with your fight or flight, you are responding to something. And so that's really what cortisol comes in for. And it is a catabolic hormone. So that means it's responsible for a breakdown. And so really the main role of cortisol is to liberate blood glucose. So you'll probably hear about some overlap between insulin and cortisol because our hormones do interplay with one another. Mm-hmm. It can get a little complex, so I'm going to not dive in too far. But really cortisol is trying to get glucose back into your bloodstream so we can use it. So it's not the opposite, but it's trying to break down so we can essentially have energy to fight or flight. That is the purpose. So cortisol really acts on our liver, our muscle, our fat, and our pancreas. And it's really interesting what happens here because we can take glucose in from our diet, but when cortisol is released, it's trying to liberate that glucose from something that we have within our body. And so what happens is cortisol is really, really good at taking amino acids, which make our proteins up, which build our muscles, and making glucose out of that. And so cortisol ends up becoming very catabolic, or it breaks down our muscles, which is actually not a great thing. And so that is why it's getting a bad rap, is because people are noticing, okay, muscle mass maybe you're not seeing it breaking down, but you're kind of hitting a plateau and not continuing to make progress in the gym. And cortisol is really good at building up fat tissue. And so it's not inherently causing weight gain, but we're noticing a redistribution of body fat viscerally, just like insulin, to be in that abdominal region. So Again, you're not spontaneously just generating calories out of thin air. If you're gaining weight, it's because you're eating in a calorie surplus, but your body composition may start to change when cortisol levels are elevated for a very long period of time. So again, cortisol is not bad. If we didn't have cortisol, we wouldn't be able to react to situations. So from an acute standpoint, super helpful. And even they did a study, it was really interesting, and they looked at cortisol levels immediately after workouts. And in the individuals who had significantly elevated levels of cortisol, that was the indicator of a good workout versus the control group who did not. And so we do need cortisol production in order to have positive adaptations in terms of like to our workouts. But when cortisol levels just stay sky high 24/7, that's when the cascade of kind of that downward spiral starts to happen. So just like insulin, it is very, very good in, when it's used correctly. But when we start to get out of whack and cortisol levels never come down to baseline, that's when we start to see those adaptations where we start to gain some fat in our abdominal region, muscle starts to break down a little bit. So it's a good thing in the short term. Anything chronically staying high ends up being a negative thing. And so this is important because cortisol actually acts on a DNA level. And so this is something that takes time to see the outcome, right? Because eventually your DNA sequences have to get translated into proteins. So it's not something where it's like, oh, my cortisol is elevated, and then the next day, you have a negative effect. It's a long-term thing. And so that's really the framework of how cortisol production happens. And so going into we kind of mentioned why it gets a bad rap. It's because the same stress response that's evolved to keep us alive, with overexposure, it can lead to what we talked about with the increase in body fat, but also a lot of these things can also lead to metabolic adaptations such as insulin resistance. So a lot of the problems that happen with too high blood sugar and insulin can happen with cortisol too. We start to see more insulin resistance, some metabolic disease start to happen. But again, if your cortisol is elevated long term, and you're gaining weight, you can't blame cortisol if your body weight is going up. But you may notice you're carrying that weight in a different spot. So I think that's why people think cortisol is their enemy, when in reality, there's a lot of things you can do to manage that cortisol. So the first, and I would say the most important thing, is sleep. And people hate on this because no one wants to stop their Netflix show an episode before to get an additional hour of sleep. But if you're not sleeping 7 to 8 hours, and I would even love to say 8 or more, but I just know schedules and all that, that is the number one place you should start. So it shouldn't be running to what supplement can I take. It's what does my sleep look like? And that's not just how many hours am I in bed. It's what are you doing before bed? Are you removing blue light an hour before you go to bed? When do you stop drinking caffeine, right? Because ideally blue light should be an hour or more, should be cut off an hour or more before bed. Caffeine intake should be cut off 6 or more hours before you go to bed. You should be sleeping in a cold environment. It should be dark. So there's lots of factors that you can consider other than how long am I in the bed for, because that's not always indicative of quality sleep, which is really the main goal. And so that would be the most important place I would start, is focusing on quality and duration of sleep. The second thing is thinking about what can you do for stress management. So we totally live in a society that's just like hustle and grind 24/7. Like, how much can you get done in a day? But we know the negative side effects of those. So I should have pointed out that our bodies, when we're having a stressor, it does not distinguish that, oh, this stressor is from lifting weights, and this stressor is because I have a work deadline tomorrow, and this stressor is because I'm stuck in traffic and have to be somewhere in 10 minutes, and this stressor is because my kids don't listen. Like, it's just stress. And so whether it's working out or something at home, our bodies don't know the difference. And so finding or carving out time in your day to be able to manage your stress somehow is very, very important. And I know that's a super broad term, but to give some examples of what that could look like for me, that's going on walks, because that's one time of day I feel like I can unplug. And I literally can not even take my phone and just go and walk and be outside, and it just clears my head, even if it's 10 minutes. Walks can be something. For some people, it's reading or journaling, prayers, nap time, baths, anything like that just kind of help you relax, take a couple deep breaths, even for 10 minutes are super helpful throughout the day. And then reducing alcohol consumption, which is, I think, something a lot of people could probably benefit from, because even if you look at the metrics, it was interesting. This was another study. The metrics looking at sleep after a night of drinking 2 or more glasses of whatever you're having decreased HRV, increased resting heart rate, increased body temperature, and increased respiratory rate one time. Those are all biomarkers of stress. And so if you think like, oh, just doing this one time in isolation can cause that much of a change, but I'm doing this 3, 4, 5 days a week, that would be another really good place to start, is reducing alcohol consumption. So there are some supplements you can take. I don't even really want to mention them because I think a lot of people could probably focus on the lifestyle factors first. And then if you're in a place where you really feel like you're crushing all of those things, then we could maybe talk about supplements. But that's really the main ways I think that could be helpful to help lower cortisol and not keep it sky high 24/7.
Yeah. Geena, so well done. Every question I was like, I'm going to ask her that, you ended up hitting it. That was
Thanks.
so beautiful and simply laid out for a very complex topic. But I was going to ask you to touch on briefly, because I know this goes into a lot, but can you explain the implications of the fact that cortisol is on a circadian rhythm, that it fluctuates throughout the day, and that's a good thing?
Yeah, cortisol is honestly what wakes us up in the morning. It is kind of the rise and shine hormone, for lack of better words. And so it is important that we do have increases and decreases in cortisol throughout the day. Like I mentioned, it's what wakes us up in the morning. It slowly should wane throughout the day. So at night, you shouldn't be on high alert, right? That's not going to be what gets us to sleep. And so our cortisol increase and decrease does correlate with our sleep and wake cycle, which is important. But when we stay cortisol high, and our sleep is impaired, it ends up being this, honestly, a vicious cycle. And that's where a lot of people's anxiety comes from, because, their cortisol stays high, they can't sleep, they feel anxious. So then the next day they're feeling really tired. They're relying maybe on caffeine or things to stimulate them. Their sleep's impaired the next day. So it's kind of a vicious cycle and hard to break, but it is a good thing for cortisol to increase and then slowly come down throughout the day.
Yeah, and it's important to point out, I love how you differentiated between the fact that, like, your body doesn't know the difference between stressors, but there are really good stressors, and there's stressors that aren't as good, right, for long periods of time.
Mm-hmm.
For example, working out is an amazing stress. You don't adapt if it's not a stressful workout, right?
Mm-hmm.
But something that I just thought is important to say is, like, when it comes to cortisol, I was someone who used to work out late in the day, very high intensity at like 5:45 p.m. And I was doing all the things in quotes right with my nutrition and everything else, and I was trying to sleep a lot. I just couldn't fall asleep. And my little caveat, if you're someone who works out in a high intensity type workout plan and it's late at night, when your cortisol, like Geena said, is going to be like slowly tapering down throughout the day so that you can fall asleep, because cortisol wakes us up. It's a big thing that wakes us up in the morning. When you work out in high intensity, it's going to spike your cortisol, right? That's a good thing because it is a good stressor, but it's a stressor. And so your adrenals are going to release cortisol when that stressor occurs. If you're someone who works out late, you don't have to change your schedule, but one thing that helped me a lot is relaxation breathing after my workout. That sounds really gimmicky and dumb, but please hang with me here and just try it, because if you're not going to move your workout around, if that's not feasible for you, this can be a really integral part of your day that can help you come down from a cortisol level after your workouts. And all I'll tell you to do, there's a bunch of stuff you can Google when it comes to box breathing or relaxation breathing, and you can get really nitty gritty with it. But for me, the thing that I find to be most manageable is just 5 minutes after my workout. I elevate my feet. That's ideal if you can, so you're laying flat on your back. And I just breathe in and out. I breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, breathe out for 5 seconds, and hold for 4. So that's box breathing. And I just do it for one song. I find a Zach Bryan song that's close to 5 minutes. I just do that. If I'm not in a setting where I can lay down, like I don't want to be that weirdo in the gym, I'll just sit in my car and do it, like before I drive. Like I'm just sitting up. It's not ideal, but the closer you can do it to finishing your workout, the better. But I get that's not always practical for people. The next best thing would be in the bed. Like if you're about to go to bed, just doing a few minutes of relaxation breathing if you work out in the afternoon, or even just to make it a staple every day, even if you don't work out in the afternoon. It can really help with stress mitigation, and you'll see a lot of benefits from it if you start implementing it.
Yeah, and Ellie, that's great, because I would have thought that was gimmicky before, and then I tried it. But it does, because it's helping to stimulate your parasympathetic nervous system. So just like we mentioned in the beginning, cortisol is that sympathetic state, fight or flight. Before we go to bed, we want to be in the parasympathetic state. We want to be in a restful state. And so when you do that box breathing, you stimulate your vagus nerve, which is in control of your parasympathetic nervous system. So it is actually scientific. Like, we're not just saying breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out. It is proven. So it sounds gimmicky, but it's like such a simple hack.
Yeah, and it's so powerful. I wish we could understand how powerful the simple things are. You see Wim Hof and how he's able to tolerate, freezing temperatures simply by his breathing. We see women who are able to give birth naturally and make it look easy through a lot of different ways, but a lot of it is breathing. Like, breathe through contractions. And I'm not saying that's the case for everyone, but if we actually understood how powerful, what Geena said, our ability to actually have an impact on our parasympathetic nervous system and our sympathetic nervous system. If I start hyperventilating, that's going to do the opposite thing. It's going to get my sympathetic system really revved up, right? Like if I'm about to hit a big lift, I'm going to try to stimulate my sympathetic nervous system through breathing, through slapping my face, smelling salt or whatever. So I think that's just my little pitch, is like, don't think you're too good for relaxation breathing. If you try it, it can really be powerful. So I didn't mean to segue us a ton, but I think a lot of people will resonate with those, like, tossing and turning at night, not being able to fall asleep. And that's cortisol a lot of times.
Yeah, that's super helpful.
Yeah. I want to see if there's another question I was going to ask you on that. You pretty much hit everything, honestly.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So hopefully, any last words you want to say about insulin or cortisol?
I don't think so. If anyone has other, like, myths or not even hormone related that they want us to cover, we're happy to do that, because it's fun for us to do these. And I know there's a lot of other things that are floating out there.
Yeah, I think we're going to try to do estrogen next, or maybe specific hormones one next. So, like Geena said, message us if you think of any others. But thank you for this, Geena. This was helpful.
Of course. See ya.
All right. See you guys.